This story follows the incredible, true-to-life but often forgotten journey of the great New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 to 1812, a time when the Mississippi River ran backward, the ground turned to liquid, and the American frontier faced an apocalypse that modern science is still trying to decode. The river that swallowed the sky. The Hook. Imagine a day when the sun rises as a pale, sickly violet orb through a haze of sulfurous smoke. Imagine the mighty Mississippi, the lifeblood of a young American nation, suddenly stopping, shivering, and then churning violently backward, swallowing islands whole. In the winter of 1811, before the age of sirens or sensors, the heart of America didn't just shake, it broke. This is not a myth of the ancient world. This happened in the United States, and the ground beneath your feet still remembers. Part 1. The Shaking Earth. The year was 1811. The American West was not California. It was the wild, dense forests of Missouri, Kentucky, and Tennessee. In the small settlement of New Madrid, life was quiet, revolving around the fur trade and the rhythmic flow of the river. Silas Thorne, a fictionalized composite of the real scouts of that era, sat on his porch on the night of December 16. The air was unnaturally still. Animals, sensitive to the deep vibrations of the tectonic plates, had begun to flee days prior. Great migrations of squirrels were seen swimming across the Ohio River, fleeing south in a panicked frenzy. At 2:15 a.m., the world exploded. It wasn't just a tremor, it was a 7.5 to 7.9 magnitude upheaval. The sound was described by survivors as a constant roar of 1,000 cannons mixed with the shrieking of tearing timber. As Silas struggled to stand, he witnessed soil liquefaction, a phenomenon where solid ground under intense pressure turns into a bubbling quicksand. Geysers of black sand and coal-infused water shot 30 feet into the air, leaving sand blows that are still visible from satellite imagery today. Part 2. The Day the River Ran Backward. For the American audience, the most legendary aspect of this event is the retrograde flow. Near the town of New Madrid, the uplifting of the riverbed created temporary waterfalls and domes. The water had nowhere to go. Thousands of tons of Mississippi current slammed into these new geological barriers and surged backward. Flatboats carrying whiskey and flour to New Orleans were tossed like toothpicks. Men who had survived the Revolutionary War wept as they watched the forest on the banks slide bodily into the dark water. In Washington, D.C., the tremors were so strong they rang the bells of the Capitol building. In Boston, thousands of miles away, the ground shivered. This was the moment the young United States realized that the Wild West held powers far greater than the British Empire or the warring tribes. Part 3. The Prophecy and the Politics. The story takes a turn into the chillingly factual intersection of history and mysticism. The great Shawnee leader Tecumseh had allegedly predicted this disaster. Seeking to unite the Native American tribes against westward expansion, he reportedly told his followers that he would stamp his foot and the white man's houses would fall. When the quakes hit, it fueled a spiritual and political fervor that changed the course of the War of 1812. The New Madrid Christians emerged. Thousands of settlers who believed the end of the world was at hand, leading to a massive religious revival in the American South and Midwest. Part 4. The Science of the Real Foot Rift. To provide the information-heavy aspect your audience craves, we look at the geology. Unlike the San Andreas Fault in California, which is a boundary fault, the New Madrid seismic zone is an intraplate fault. It is a failed rift, a place where the North American continent tried to pull itself apart hundreds of millions of years ago. The density of the North American craton allowed the seismic waves to travel 20 times further than they do in California. This is why the 1811 quake was felt over 1 million square miles, whereas the 1906 San Francisco quake was felt over only 60,000 square miles. The narrative continues. The story would follow Silas as he journeys through the decimated landscape, witnessing the birth of Reelfoot Lake in Tennessee, a lake created literally overnight when the forest sank and the river filled the depression. It would detail the struggle of the early pioneers to rebuild in a land that felt cursed and the long-term impact on American westward migration. Key historical elements included in the full version: the hard winter, how the cold amplified the suffering of those whose homes were leveled. The steamship New Orleans, the first steamboat on the Mississippi, was actually on its maiden voyage during the earthquake, providing a harrowing modern perspective on the disaster. The first disaster relief, the New Madrid Act of 1815, which was the first time the U.S. federal government provided disaster relief to its citizens. As the tremors continued for months, the story moves from the initial shock to the grueling survival of a transformed continent. This next part focuses on the harrowing journey of the first ever steamboat on the Mississippi and the eerie year of the comet. Chapter 2: The Fire Ship and the Falling Stars. While the ground was liquefying in Missouri, a marvel of the modern age was steaming directly into the heart of the apocalypse. The New Orleans, the first steamboat to ever attempt the journey from Pittsburgh to New Orleans, was carrying the Roosevelt family. They were symbols of the Industrial Revolution, believing that steam and steel had finally conquered nature. They were wrong. The steamship's nightmare. As the New Orleans entered the Ohio River, the crew noticed the atmosphere changing. The air grew thick with a dark, sulfurous vapor that obscured the sun. On the night of December 16th, while the first great quake hit, the passengers felt the boat shudder as if it had struck a rock. But there was no rock. The riverbed itself was rising. Nicholas Roosevelt, the captain, looked out to see the riverbanks collapsing. Giant sycamores, centuries old, were falling into the water like matchsticks. The most terrifying sight were the river pirates. These were not men, but massive uprooted trees that had become stuck in the river mud, their jagged limbs bobbing up and down with the current, ready to impale any ship that passed. The New Orleans became a floating ghost ship. Because the earthquakes had physically moved islands and shifted the river's path, their maps were now useless. Landmarks that had existed for generations vanished overnight. The crew had to navigate a new river that was being born in fire and mud. The Great Comet of 1811. Adding to the terror was a celestial omen. For months leading up to and during the quakes, Tecumseh's comet C/1811 F1 blazed across the sky. To the pioneers and to the native tribes, this was not a scientific curiosity, it was a divine warning. The comet was one of the largest in recorded history, visible to the naked eye for 260 days. In the deep woods of the American frontier, where there was no light pollution, the comet was so bright it cast shadows at night. Survivors described the terrifying contrast, a sky on fire with a ghostly blue tail, while the ground beneath them roared and split open. The night the earth breathed. In the settlement of Little Prairie, the residents witnessed something that modern geologists call co-seismic subsidence. Silas, our scout, watched as an entire forest sank below the water table. He wrote in his journal, "The earth didn't just shake, it breathed. It rose in great waves like the ocean. I saw a crack open that was wide enough to swallow a horse, and from its depths came a hiss of gas that smelled like the pits of hell itself." The settlers began to experience earthquake sickness, a combination of nausea from the constant swaying and the psychological trauma of losing the only stable thing they knew, the ground. To prevent being swallowed by the opening fissures, families began felling tall trees and laying them crosswise, building temporary bridges to sleep on so they wouldn't fall into the earth during the night. The social collapse. Information traveled slowly in 1812. In the East, cities like Richmond and Washington, D.C. felt the shocks and assumed a volcano had erupted in the West. Rumors spread that the British had developed a seismic weapon or that the continent was breaking apart. In the vibration-hit zones, law and order evaporated. Jails collapsed and prisoners escaped into the woods. The New Madrid Christians began a frantic movement of repentance, convinced that the end of the world was at hand. They abandoned their farms and flocked to the hills, chanting and praying as the aftershocks, which numbered in the thousands, kept the bells of their fallen churches ringing. Historical data point: the magnitude. While we don't have seismograph readings from 1812, modern researchers using modified Mercalli intensity scales have estimated the following. The energy released was equivalent to thousands of Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs detonating simultaneously beneath the American heartland. The tremors of December and January were merely the prologue. As the calendar turned to February 1812, the settlers believed the worst had passed. They were exhausted, living in makeshift lean-tos, their nerves frayed by the constant microshocks that kept the porcelain rattling and the dogs howling. Then came the hard shock. Chapter 3: The Hard Shock and the Birth of Reelfoot. On February 7th, 1812, at approximately 3:45 a.m., the final and most powerful earthquake of the sequence struck. It centered directly under the town of New Madrid. If the previous quakes were warnings, this was the execution. The destruction of New Madrid. Silas Thorne was camped 5 miles inland when the blast hit. It didn't feel like a shake. It felt like the earth had been struck by a massive hammer from below. The town of New Madrid, already weakened, simply ceased to exist as a habitable place. The high bluffs upon which the town sat gave way in a terrifying display of mass wasting. Acres of land, houses, gardens, and livestock included, slid into the churning Mississippi. The screams of the residents were drowned out by the sound of the riverbed itself cracking. The night the river ran backward, the reality. This was the moment the legend of the backward-flowing Mississippi became historical fact. The February 7th quake created a series of fault scarps, sharp vertical offsets across the riverbed. One of these scarps acted as a temporary dam, thrusting the riverbed upward. The massive volume of water traveling south with the force of a continent's drainage hit this new wall of earth and rock. With nowhere to go, the water surged violently backward for several hours. This retrograde flow created a massive whirlpool near the bend of the river that sucked in every flatboat and piece of debris within miles. The creation of Reelfoot Lake. As the land was thrust upward in some places, it dropped significantly in others. South of the epicenter, a vast cypress forest began to sink. This area, known as a footprint of the rift, dropped by nearly 20 feet in a matter of hours. As the Mississippi flooded backward and overflowed its banks, it poured into this newly formed depression. Thousands of acres of forest were submerged instantly. This was the birth of Reelfoot Lake in Tennessee. To this day, if you boat through the lake, you can see the ghost decoys, the tops of ancient cypress trees that were drowned in 1812, standing as underwater monuments to that morning. The New Madrid Dread. The psychological impact on the American frontier was permanent. In the aftermath of the February shock, a strange phenomenon occurred, the Great Awakening of the West. Churches that had been empty for years were suddenly overflowing. People walked for hundreds of miles to confess sins, convinced that the United States was being judged. But there was also a darker side. Suspicion fell on strangers, and the political tension between the settlers and the Native American tribes reached a boiling point. The British, currently at odds with the U.S., were rumored to have planted earth powder in the ground to destroy the American expansion. The survival of the New Orleans. Miraculously, the steamboat New Orleans survived. After the February shock, Nicholas Roosevelt found his ship anchored in what used to be the middle of the river, but now was a shallow sandbar surrounded by dead fish and sunken trees. They managed to find a new channel steaming past the ruins of New Madrid. The passengers reported seeing people standing on the banks, begging to be taken aboard, their faces covered in the black silt that had erupted from the sand blows. Roosevelt couldn't stop. The river was too volatile and the ship was low on fuel. They forged ahead, eventually reaching New Orleans to deliver the news that the interior of the continent had turned into a wasteland. Information Deep Dive. The sand blows. One of the most unique features of this event was the eruption of earthquake coal. Because the New Madrid region sits on ancient peat and coal bogs, the pressure of the quake forced liquefied sand mixed with lignite, brown coal, to the surface. The sight? Miles of white sand fields suddenly appearing in the middle of dark green forests. The smell? Survivors reported a heavy scent of sulfur and rotten eggs, likely hydrogen sulfide gas released from the disturbed organic layers deep underground. The story now moves toward the aftermath, the first federal disaster relief in American history, and the terrifying question that haunts modern geologists: when will it happen again? By April 1812, the Earth had finally stopped its violent heaving, but the landscape was unrecognizable. The geography of the American heartland had been redrawn by a blind, subterranean hand. Silas Thorne, traveling back toward what remained of the river settlements, described a world that felt hollow. The ghost forests and the dead river. The Mississippi River, once a vibrant highway of commerce, was now a graveyard. The February hard shock had dumped so much sediment and timber into the water that the river's depth had changed entirely. Massive islands of tangled logs, some miles long, blocked the channels. In Tennessee and Missouri, the ghost forests stood in the middle of new lakes. These were thousands of oak and walnut trees, killed by the sudden flooding of their roots. Their gray, skeletal branches reached out of the water, providing a haunting visual reminder that where there was once dry land and pioneer cabins, there was now only dark, stagnant water. The New Madrid Certificates, America's first bailout. As news of the devastation reached Washington, D.C., the federal government faced a crisis. Hundreds of families had lost everything. Their land had quite literally sunk or been buried under 3 feet of sterile white sand. For the first time in United States history, the government felt compelled to act as a safety net. In 1815, Congress passed the New Madrid Relief Act. The deal? Settlers who could prove their land was damaged could trade their worthless Missouri dirt for certificates allowing them to claim new land in other parts of the public domain, mostly in the newly opened Illinois territory. The reality? This led to one of the first great land grab scandals in American history. Speculators and land sharks rushed to the devastated area, buying up the rights of illiterate, traumatized farmers for pennies on the dollar, then using their certificates to claim prime real estate elsewhere. The legacy of the Tecumseh curse. The earthquakes had a profound impact on the War of 1812. The Shawnee leader Tecumseh, whose stamp of the foot was believed to have started the quakes, saw his tribal confederacy grow in strength as terrified natives viewed the disaster as a divine command to expel the settlers. However, the quakes also destroyed the infrastructure the tribes needed to sustain a long war. The swampy areas that provided cover and food were decimated. When Tecumseh eventually fell in battle in 1813, many of his followers believed the earth had finished its work, the Great Spirit had spoken, and the age of the frontier was over. Chapter 5: The Sleeping Giant, the Modern Warning. The story of New Madrid did not end in 1812. It became a ghost story told by grandfathers in Kentucky and Missouri. For a century, people forgot. They built cities, Memphis, St. Louis, and Cairo, directly on top of the soft, unstable river silt. The scientific mystery. Modern geologists are fascinated by the New Madrid seismic zone because it defies the standard rules of plate tectonics. Usually, big quakes happen at the edges of plates, like the San Andreas Fault in California. New Madrid is in the middle of a plate. Scientists discovered the Real-Foot Rift, a deep scar in the Earth's crust dating back 750 million years. The North American continent once tried to pull itself apart right there. It failed, but the bruise remains. Today, the weight of the continent and the pressure from the Atlantic Ocean pushing westward continue to squeeze this old scar. The $300 billion question. If the 1811 to 1812 sequence happened today, infrastructure, modern bridges across the Mississippi are not built for a magnitude 8.0 event. The soil, the liquefaction that Silas witnessed, would happen again, but this time it would take down skyscrapers, fiber optic cables, and natural gas pipelines that power the eastern United States. The impact? Experts estimate that a repeat of the hard shock would cause over $300 billion in damage, making it the costliest natural disaster in world history. Epilogue: The river remembers. Silas Thorne lived to be an old man. He never liked to sleep in a house with a cellar, and he always kept a boat tied to his porch, even if he lived miles from the water. He knew what the modern world often forgets, that the ground is not solid. It is a living, shifting skin over an ancient, restless giant. Every few decades, the bells in the Midwest still ring on their own, a small tremor, a reminder from the New Madrid Fault. The Mississippi continues to flow south, but beneath its muddy waters, the river pirates and the sunken forests of 1812 wait in the dark, reminding us that the heart of America has a rhythm of its own, and it is overdue for another beat. Since we have covered the historical timeline and the immediate geological aftermath, we now move into the unsolved mysteries and the harrowing what-if survival scenario that captures the imagination of the modern American audience. This part explores the terrifying transition from historical fact to modern-day vulnerability. Chapter 6: The Shadows of the Fault. For decades after the 1812 shocks, the settlers of the Mississippi Valley lived in a state of hypervigilance. But as the 19th century bled into the 20th, the big one became a campfire story. The massive oaks regrew, the sandblows were covered by cornfields, and the scars on the earth were hidden by the concrete of a rising superpower. But the earth was not done. The 1895 wake-up call. In 1812, there were no skyscrapers. In 1895, a magnitude 6.6 quake centered in Charleston, Missouri, reminded the nation that the monster was still breathing. It was felt in 23 states. It cracked the walls of the newly built state houses and shattered windows from Chicago to New Orleans. This was the moment science began to realize that the New Madrid seismic zone was not a one-off event. It was a cyclic predator. The Iben Browning Panic of 1990. To understand the American psyche regarding this fault, one must look at the winter of 1990. A climatologist named Iben Browning predicted, with no scientific basis other than tidal forces, that the New Madrid Fault would rupture again on December 3, 1990. The result was a cultural phenomenon. National Guard. Units in Missouri and Tennessee were put on high alert. School closures. Hundreds of schools across the Deep South and Midwest closed their doors. Survivalism. Sales of freeze-dried food and emergency radios skyrocketed. While the quake never happened, the panic revealed a deep-seated American fear. The East is not ready. Chapter 7. The What If, an 8.0 today. Imagine Silas Thorne's world, but with 15 million people living in the impact zone. If the hard shock were to strike at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday in the modern era, the narrative would shift from a pioneer survival story to a national catastrophe. The island of Memphis. Memphis, Tennessee sits directly on the bluffs above the fault. Because the city is built on unconsolidated river sediment, the ground would undergo seismic amplification. The soil would act like jelly. Bridge failure. The bridges connecting Tennessee to Arkansas, I-40 and I-55, would likely buckle or collapse. The lifeblood of the American supply chain would be severed in seconds. The gas lines. The major natural gas pipelines that heat the Northeast, New York, D.C., Boston, pass directly through the new Madrid zone. A major rupture would freeze the East Coast in midwinter. The Mississippi Seiche. In 1812, the river ran backward. Today, a similar quake would create a seiche, a standing wave in an enclosed or semi-enclosed body of water. The Mississippi would slosh violently from bank to bank, overtopping levees and flooding the low-lying delta regions within minutes. Chapter 8. The Silent Sentinels. Today, the New Madrid seismic zone is the most monitored piece of ground in the American interior. Groups like the USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey, and the CISEC, the Central United States Earthquake Consortium, have placed hundreds of sensors deep into the bedrock. They listen to the microquakes, the tiny, imperceptible snaps of the real-foot rift. They hear about 200 of them a year. Most people don't feel them, but the machines do. Each pop is a release of tension, but it's also a reminder that the pressure is building. The final mystery. Is it dying or dreaming? There is a heated debate in the scientific community. Some researchers suggest that the New Madrid fault is shutting down, that the GPS data shows the North American plate is no longer twisting as much as it used to. Others, the traditionalists, point to the 4,000 years of paleoseismic evidence found in the layers of Mississippi mud. They have found evidence of massive quakes in 900 AD, 1450 AD, and 1811 AD. The math is simple and terrifying. The fault triggers roughly 400 to 500 years. The story's end. A warning from Silas. If we return to the fictional journal of our scout, Silas Thorne, we find his final entry from 1820. He was leaving the valley for good, heading toward the rocky, stable ground of the Appalachian Mountains. Men think they own the land because they put a fence around it, but I have seen the land rise up and throw a man off like a horse throws a burr. The river will find its path, and the earth will take its rest, and it cares not for our maps or our cities. Listen to the squirrels when they run, and watch the water when it stills. The giant isn't dead, he's just holding his breath. Interactive conclusion. This story is a blend of hard geology, forgotten American history, and the chilling reality of our infrastructure. While we have explored the history and the science, the true American story of the New Madrid sequence lies in its unexplained anomalies, the bizarre phenomena that turned a natural disaster into a supernatural legend. These accounts were documented by thousands of terrified witnesses and remain some of the most debated mysteries in American folklore. One of the most unsettling aspects for the 1812 survivors wasn't just the shaking ground, it was the sky. Months before and during the hard shock, the atmosphere over the Mississippi Valley began to behave in ways that defied the physics of the time. The earthquake lights. Survivors from Missouri to Georgia reported seeing earthquake lights. Long before the invention of the electric light bulb, the night sky was suddenly illuminated by flashes of blue, violet, and white light. The phenomenon, witnesses described glows emanating from the ground and balls of fire shooting from the fissures. The modern explanation, geologists now believe this was piezoelectricity. When quartz-bearing rocks, like those deep in the Reelfoot Rift, are compressed with extreme force, they generate a massive electric charge that can ionize the air, creating a luminous glow similar to the northern lights, but originating from the soil. The violet sun and the sulfur mist. For nearly a year, the sun never looked the same. The quakes released vast quantities of trapped methane and hydrogen sulfide from ancient subterranean pockets. This gas reacted with the humidity of the river valley to create a thick, yellowish-violet smog. Settlers reported that the sun appeared as a pale, bloody disk that provided no warmth. This atmospheric distortion contributed to the New Madrid dread, as people felt they were living in a literal purgatory where the laws of nature had been suspended. Chapter 10. The Legend of the Sunken Ships. As the river churned and reversed, it didn't just destroy boats, it buried them in time. The Mississippi is a living river that meanders and changes course. When the 1812 quakes hit, they froze the river's geography in certain places. The lost wealth of the frontier. In the chaos of February 1812, dozens of flatboats carrying silver, whiskey, and fur were pulled into the massive whirlpools created by the retrograde flow. Because the river channel shifted so drastically, many of these boats were buried under 30 feet of silt and mud within hours. The legend, to this day, treasure hunters and historians search the Oxbow Lakes and dry farmland of Arkansas and Tennessee for the remains of these 1812 wrecks. The reality, in the 1990s, a drought lowered the Mississippi to record levels, revealing the skeletal remains of several 19th century ships that had been lost to the earth nearly 2 centuries prior. Chapter 11. The New Madrid Cursed Zone. To the modern USA audience, the most fascinating part of this story is how it shaped the American landscape. There are parts of the Boot Heel of Missouri and the Purchase region of Kentucky that are still functionally unusable for large-scale construction because of what happened in 1812. The Sandblow Deserts. In some counties, you can still find sandblows, areas where the soil is so sandy and acidic from the 1812 eruptions that nothing but scrub brush will grow. These are silent scars on the American map, visible from thousands of feet in the air as white circular patches in otherwise green farm fields. The urban legends of Memphis. In Memphis, Tennessee, stories persist of the deep roar. Residents in the older parts of the city occasionally report hearing a low-frequency vibration, a sound that some believe is the fault line talking. While often dismissed as traffic or industrial noise, for the descendants of those who survived 1812, the sound is a chilling reminder of Silas Thorne's warning: the giant is only holding his breath. Conclusion: the American Apocalypse. The New Madrid Earthquakes of 1811-1812 remain the greatest forgotten disaster in American history. It wasn't just a geological event, it was a cultural, religious, and political turning point. It tested the resilience of a young nation and proved that the manifest destiny of the United States was always subject to the whims of the tectonic plates beneath. As the sun sets over the modern Mississippi with its massive bridges and bustling tugboats, the river looks peaceful. But deep below, in the dark, cold cracks of the Reelfoot Rift, the pressure is mounting. The white sand is waiting to blow. The river is waiting to turn, and the history we have written is merely the prologue for the next time the earth decides to stamp its foot. While the physical shaking eventually subsided, the 80,000-word scope of this epic must now turn to the human echoes, the strange, enduring cultural and supernatural legacy that survived long after the ground solidified. For the American audience, this is where history meets the Twilight Zone. By the summer of 1812, the new Madrid dread had changed the American personality. The frontier was no longer just a land of opportunity, it was a land of omens. The death of Tecumseh and the end of the stamp. The Native American leader Tecumseh had become a figure of mythic proportions. When he died at the Battle of the Thames in 1813, many settlers breathed a sigh of relief, believing the magic that caused the quakes died with him. However, his prophecy of the foot stamp lingered. Historical records from the time show a massive shift in migration patterns. Tens of thousands of pioneers who were headed for the fertile soils of the Mississippi Valley turned their wagons around. They headed towards the Great Lakes or deep into the Texas territories, then part of Mexico, terrified that the River of Fire would swallow them if they stayed. This geological event actually slowed the settlement of the American Midwest by nearly a decade. The Earthquake Christians and the Shaker Societies. The religious fervor didn't vanish, it evolved. The Shakers, a radical religious sect known for their ecstatic dancing or shaking, saw a massive surge in membership. They believed the earth's trembling was a literal physical manifestation of the Holy Spirit. In the backwoods of Kentucky, people built earthquake houses, small, circular cabins made of light willow branches. They believed if the earth moved again, a circular house would roll rather than collapse, a primitive but fascinating precursor to modern seismic-resistant architecture. Chapter 13. The Modern Ghost Towns. To understand the scale of the 1812 event, one must look at what remains, or rather, what doesn't remain. Across the boot heel of Missouri and the Purchase region of Kentucky, there are dozens of drowned settlements. The town under the lake. Before 1812, there was a thriving trading post where Reelfoot Lake now sits. When the ground dropped 20 feet and the river poured in, the town wasn't just flooded, it was entombed. The mystery, scuba divers and sonar teams in the late 1900s have reported finding structured anomalies beneath the silt of Reelfoot Lake, timbers that appear to be hand-hewn, potentially the remains of the homes that Silas Thorne saw disappear. The Bells of the Deep. Local legend in northwest Tennessee claims that on the anniversary of the February 7th quake, you can still hear the muffled tolling of a church bell from beneath the dark waters of the lake. Scientists attribute this to methane burps or shifting logs, but the locals know better. Chapter 14. The Big One in the Modern Mind. As we move toward the conclusion of this historical saga, we must address the modern American anxiety. For an audience in the U.S., the New Madrid fault isn't just a history lesson, it's a ticking clock. The vulnerability of the supply chain. In 1812, the economy was flour and fur. Today, the New Madrid seismic zone is the crossroads of America. FedEx Superhub. The world's busiest cargo hub is located in Memphis, Tennessee, directly on the fault. The I-40 bridge. This bridge is the primary artery for trucking between the east and west coasts. A collapse would effectively split the United States economy in half for months. The gas pipelines. The pipelines mentioned earlier are not just for heat. They fuel the power plants that keep the internet servers of Northern Virginia, the heart of the global web, running. The Federal Emergency Management, FEMA, drills. Every few years, the U.S. government conducts shakeout drills involving millions of people across 20 states. They prepare for the new Madrid scenario. Unlike California, where people are used to small tremors, the residents of the Midwest haven't felt a major quake in generations. The seismic risk gap is the most dangerous part of the story, the lack of public memory. Epilogue. The river always wins. The 80,000-word journey of the 1811 to 1812 earthquakes is a story of a young nation's collision with the infinite power of the planet. It is a story of how we built a civilization on a bruise in the Earth's crust, hoping that the giant would stay asleep for just one more generation. Silas Thorne's last journal entry, discovered in an attic in Virginia decades later, sums up the American experience with the New Madrid fault. We think we have tamed the Mississippi with our levees and our steam engines, but I remember the night the river turned tail and ran. I remember the violet sun. The earth doesn't care about our progress. It only cares about its own ancient, slow rhythm. And one day it will need to stretch its legs again. As we move into the final chapters of this 80,000-word scope, the narrative shifts from the survivors of the past to the modern-day guardians, the scientists, engineers, and historians who are currently racing against time to prevent the next 1812. This part explores the deep science and the chilling reality of how a modern superpower prepares for an ancient threat. Chapter 15. The Secret Language of the Craton. For over a century, the New Madrid seismic zone was a mystery because it looked like nothing else on Earth. Most earthquakes happen where plates crash together, but the U.S. Midwest is in the middle of a craton, the oldest, thickest, and most stable part of the North American continent. The gravity anomalies. In the 1970s, the U.S. Geological Survey began flying planes with sensitive magnetometers over Missouri and Tennessee. They found something startling: the magnetic scars. Deep beneath the surface, there are massive bodies of iron-rich volcanic rock that shouldn't be there. These are the remnants of the failed rift that tried to split America in two. These magnetic anomalies act like stress concentrators. Imagine a sheet of glass with a tiny scratch in the middle. When you bend the glass, the break starts at the scratch. The New Madrid fault is that scratch in the heart of the American plate. The GPS mystery. In the early 2000s, a scientific controversy erupted. Scientists placed high-precision GPS sensors across the fault to see if the ground was moving. For years, the sensors showed nothing. The dead fault theory. Some scientists argued that the 1812 quakes were a dying gasp and the fault was no longer a threat. The reloading theory. Others argued that the fault is locked and loaded. Because the crust in the Midwest is so cold and rigid, it doesn't creep or bend like the San Andreas in California. It stays perfectly still until it snaps completely. The consensus today is the snap is coming. It's not a matter of if, but when. Chapter 16. The 24-hour countdown. The modern scenario. To give the American audience a sense of the scale, we must look at what day zero would look like in the 21st century. The initial pulse. If a 7.8 magnitude quake hit today, the shock waves would travel through the cold crust of the Midwest with terrifying efficiency. In California, the ground absorbs shock like a sponge. In the Midwest, the ground acts like a bell. A quake in Missouri would ring the skyscrapers of Chicago, St. Louis, and Memphis like hammers. The liquefaction of infrastructure. The most astonishing and information-heavy aspect of this is the fate of the U.S. inland waterways. The levees. The thousands of miles of levees that protect American farmland would likely settle or slump into the river. The pipelines. The Texas Eastern and Tennessee gas pipelines, which carry trillions of cubic feet of natural gas to the northeast, would be sheared off. In winter, this would trigger a secondary disaster: millions of people in NYC and D.C. without heat during a blizzard. Chapter 17. The Legacy of Silas Thorne's Descendants. In our story, we follow the fictional descendant of Silas Thorne, Dr. Elena Thorne, a modern seismologist working for the Center for Earthquake Research and Information, CERI, in Memphis. While excavating a site near the old New Madrid settlement, Elena discovers a paleoseismic signature, a layer of sand from 1812 buried under 1450 AD sand, which is buried under 900 AD sand. She realizes the pattern is accelerating. She finds Silas's old journal, which mentions the violet sky and the sulfur mist. Connecting his observations with modern chemical sensors, she realizes that the fault releases a specific type of radon gas months before a major rupture. The race to warn a nation. The story climaxes with Elena trying to convince a skeptical government to move the national FedEx hub and reinforce the Mississippi bridges. It's a battle between economic short-termism and geological reality. The story highlights a uniquely American struggle, the tension between a culture of progress and the harsh, unyielding laws of the earth. Conclusion: the pulse of the heartland. The story of the New Madrid earthquakes is not just a tale of the past, it is a living narrative. As you read this, the pressure is building. Every time a small 2.0 tremor is felt in a quiet Missouri town, it is the earth clearing its throat. We have built a world of glass and steel on top of a giant that is prone to waking up. The 1811 to 1812 story serves as the ultimate historical warning. We have been told what the earth can do. The question is, will we listen to the echoes of Silas Thorne before the ground begins to roar once more?